The chains came first, before the words, before the explanation, before anything that could be called mercy. Elena Voss felt the cold metal close around her wrists and thought, for one terrible second, that this had to be some kind of mistake. Moonsilver did not belong on her skin. It belonged on prisoners, on traitors, on wolves who had broken the laws of the pack so badly that their own kind no longer trusted them to walk free. She had done nothing. She had only stood beside Killian Ashford an hour earlier, her hand in his, her heart hammering with a joy she had waited her whole life to feel. The mate bond had chosen him. She had felt it snap into place the moment their eyes met across the fire pit at her birthday gathering, a warmth spreading through her chest, so sudden and so complete that she had laughed out loud, startled by her own happiness. Killian had smiled back at her, and for 1 hour, one single golden hour, Elena Voss believed her life was finally beginning. Now she knelt on the cold stone floor of the pack hall, chains biting into her wrists, and she understood that the hour had been a lie. Killian. Her voice cracked on his name. Killian, tell them to stop. Tell them this is wrong. He would not look at her. He stood near the head table beside his father, the pack alpha, his shoulders squared in the stiff, formal posture of a man performing loyalty for an audience. Elena searched his face for some sign of the warmth she had felt only an hour before, some flicker of the boy who had once carved her name into the bark of the old oak tree by the river when they were children, long before either of them understood what a mate bond even was. She found nothing. His jaw was tight. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere above her head, as if looking directly at her might cost him something he was not willing to pay. "It isn't wrong," he said finally, and his voice was steady in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. "It's necessary." The word landed like a slap. Necessary. As if she were a debt to be settled, a resource to be spent. Around the hall, the pack elders murmured among themselves, some with pity in their eyes, most with careful blankness, the kind of expression people wore when they had decided it was safer not to feel anything at all. Elena searched the crowd for a friendly face, and found only lowered eyes and folded arms. No one moved to help her. No one spoke against what was happening. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that this had been decided long before tonight. The birthday celebration, the fire pit, the mate bond igniting in front of witnesses, all of it had been staged. Not the bond itself, that was real. She could still feel it thrumming faintly under her ribs even now, a cruel reminder of what should have been hers. But the timing, the location, the audience. Killian's father had wanted proof. He had wanted the whole pack to see that his son's mate existed, and was, by pack law, his to give away. "Why?" Elena asked, and this time her voice did not crack. It came out low and hard, the voice of someone who refused to be small, even while kneeling in chains. "Why would you do this to me?" Killian's father, Alpha Corwin Ashford, stepped forward instead of his son. He was a broad man, with silver threading through his dark beard, and he had never once, in all the years Elena had known him, looked at her the way he looked at her now, like a merchant assessing a shipment. "King Draven Nightshade has ruled over every pack in this territory for 3 decades, Corwin said, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. "His health has failed. The rot spreading through his body has no cure that any healer has found. When he dies without an heir, this territory will fall into chaos. Every pack will fight every other pack for the throne. Blood will run through these hills for a generation. And you think giving me away stops that?" Elena's laugh came out sharp and disbelieving. "I think," Corwin said, "that a gesture of loyalty to a dying king, delivered at exactly the right moment, could secure this pack's position when the throne changes hands. Draven has asked for tribute. A mate-bonded woman, gifted freely, is the highest honor a pack can offer. It proves loyalty beyond politics. It proves loyalty beyond blood." Elena turned back to Killian, searching one more time for some trace of the man who had held her hand an hour ago. "You knew," she said. "You knew this was the plan before the bond even happened." He did not deny it. That silence told her everything. "I have a duty to my pack," Killian said at last, each word measured and careful, rehearsed. "I will be Alpha one day. I cannot let one bond, however strong, undo generations of careful positioning. My father is right. This is bigger than us." "Bigger than us," Elena repeated. The words tasted like ash. You offered me to a dying king like I was livestock, and you call that bigger than us." For the briefest moment, something flickered behind Killian's eyes, something that might have been guilt or regret, or simple discomfort at watching a thing he had agreed to in the abstract become real and painful in front of him. But whatever it was, he swallowed it down and turned his face away again, and the moment passed, as if it had never existed at all. Two guards hauled Elena to her feet. The chains clinked against each other, moon silver burning faintly against her skin, not enough to scar but enough to remind her, every second, that she was a prisoner now and not a free woman. She did not fight them. She had learned, in the space of 1 hour, that fighting only invited more force, and she needed her strength for whatever came next. "You'll regret this," she said to Killian, as the guards turned her toward the doors. "One day you will understand exactly what you gave away, and it will be too late to take it back." He said nothing. He did not even watch her go. As the guards led her out through the great doors of the pack hall, Elena caught one last glimpse of the gathering behind her, the long tables still set with half-finished food from what was supposed to have been a celebration, candles still burning, as if the evening had not just been torn apart. She thought of all the years leading up to this moment, all the small memories she had carried with her without ever questioning their worth. Killian teaching her to skip stones across the river when she was 8 years old, both of them laughing until their sides hurt. Killian sitting beside her the night her mother passed, saying nothing at all, simply staying until dawn, because he understood that some grief did not need words. She had built a quiet, private hope around those memories for years, long before either of them carried a mate mark. The hope that whoever her fated bond turned out to be, it might be him. When it finally happened, when his eyes met hers across that fire and something ancient and certain locked into place inside her chest, she had felt, for 1 hour, as though the universe had confirmed every hope she had ever dared to hold. She understood now that hope had been foolish. Not because the bond was false, the bond was real. She could still feel its faint, stubborn pull, even as the doors closed behind her, and sealed her away from everyone she had ever known. But foolish, because she had assumed a bond meant loyalty, and loyalty, she now understood, meant nothing at all, when weighed against ambition. The journey to the Nightshade stronghold took 2 full days, mostly in silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of horse hooves against packed dirt roads, and the occasional low conversation between the guards escorting her. Elena sat in the back of a covered wagon, wrists still bound, watching the familiar hills of her childhood slide past the canvas flap and disappear behind her, replaced by unfamiliar forests, darker and denser, the trees growing close together, as if huddling against something. She thought, during those long, silent hours, about everything she thought she knew about her life. She had grown up believing that the mate bond was sacred, that when it finally arrived, it would mark the beginning of something unbreakable. She had believed Killian was kind, steady, someone who would protect her the way pack law promised every bonded mate would be protected. She had believed her own pack, the people who had raised her, fed her, taught her to run through the forest under a full moon, would never hand her over to a stranger, like a piece of furniture being traded between households. All of it had been wrong. Every single belief had cracked apart in the space of one evening, and now she was left picking through the wreckage, trying to figure out who she was, without any of the old certainties to lean on. The wagon jolted over uneven ground, and Elena pressed her bound hands against the wooden bench to steady herself, watching the world change beyond the canvas flap. The hills of her home territory were rolling and green, dotted with familiar farmhouses and grazing sheep, the kind of landscape she had run across countless times in her wolf form, feeling the wind move through her fur and the earth solid beneath her paws. As the wagon carried her further from everything she knew, the land began to shift into something wilder and less forgiving. Trees grew taller and closer together, their canopies blotting out patches of sky. The road narrowed, until it was barely wide enough for the wagon to pass, hemmed in on both sides by dense undergrowth that seemed to lean inward, as if watching. She spoke little during those first hours, partly from exhaustion, and partly because she did not trust her own voice, not to break if she used it. The guards escorting her spoke among themselves in low tones, discussing supply routes and weather, treating her presence in the wagon as an unremarkable piece of cargo that required minimal attention. Only Callum, the youngest of the group, occasionally glanced back toward her with something like sympathy in his expression, though he said nothing during those early hours. perhaps unwilling to draw attention from the others. By the second night, the guards allowed her out of the wagon to stretch her legs near a campfire, though they kept the chains on and watched her closely. One of them, a younger man with tired eyes named Callum, offered her a share of dried meat and a blanket without being asked. It was such a small kindness, but Elena found herself blinking back tears at the simple gesture, the first genuine warmth she had felt since the chains closed around her wrists. "You don't have to be frightened of the king," Callum said quietly, staring into the fire, rather than at her. "I've heard things. He's not what the stories say anymore." "What do you mean?" Callum hesitated, glancing toward the other guards to make sure they weren't listening. "The rot. It's not just weakening him. People say he barely leaves his chambers anymore. Some say he's dying faster than anyone admits. There's no cruelty left in him, or so the rumors go, just exhaustion." Elena turned this information over in her mind long after Callum had gone quiet, staring instead at the flickering flames. A dying king, a tribute gift, a pack desperate for political advantage. None of it painted a picture of what waited for her at the end of this journey, and the uncertainty was almost worse than knowing something terrible for certain would have been. On the morning of the third day, the forest thinned and the Nightshade stronghold came into view for the first time. Elena had imagined many things during the long journey: towers of gleaming stone, banners snapping proudly in the wind, the kind of grand and intimidating fortress that stories described when they spoke of powerful kings. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat, for an entirely different reason. The stronghold was enormous, yes, its walls rising high, and its towers piercing the gray morning sky, but everything about it seemed to sag under some invisible weight. Ivy had crept unchecked across sections of the outer wall, some of it brown and withered, as though even the plants growing on the castle had lost the will to thrive. Several windows stood dark and shuttered despite the early hour. The banners that did fly hung limp in the still air, their once proud colors faded by years of neglect. It was the image of a place that had once been magnificent, and was now simply enduring, holding itself together through sheer stubbornness rather than strength. A chill ran through Elena that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had grown up hearing stories about King Draven Nightshade, the way every child in the territory had. He was spoken of as a figure larger than life, a wolf so powerful that no rival pack had dared challenge his rule in over 2 decades. Her grandmother used to tell her that Draven had once faced down 3 rival alphas in a single night and walked away without a scratch, that his howl alone could be heard from one end of the territory to the other, that his court was the grandest anyone had ever seen. Looking now at the sagging towers and the wild, untended courtyard beyond the gate, Elena found it almost impossible to reconcile those old stories with the ruin in front of her. Perhaps, she thought, the stories had always been exaggerated, the way stories about powerful men so often were. Or perhaps something truly terrible had happened here, slowly, over years, while the rest of the territory continued believing in a legend that no longer matched reality. The wagon rolled through an outer gate, manned by guards who barely glanced at the new arrival, their eyes distant, their postures weary, in a way that spoke of long service to a cause that no longer inspired much enthusiasm. Elena was escorted down from the wagon and marched across a courtyard where the grass grew wild between broken cobblestones, past servants who moved with their heads down and their voices hushed, as though loud noise might disturb something fragile. She was brought to a small antechamber and left there for what felt like hours, still in chains, with nothing to do but study the faded tapestries on the walls and try to steady the frantic beating of her own heart. The tapestries depicted scenes of past glory, wolves in formation beneath a banner of a golden crown, a king standing tall and radiant at the center of it all. Elena wondered how long ago those images had been true, and how much of the man in the tapestry still existed in whatever waited behind these walls now. When the door finally opened, it was not the king who entered, but a tall, sharp-featured man dressed in dark formal robes, his expression carrying the particular blend of authority and irritation of someone accustomed to managing other people's business. He introduced himself as Lord Servin, chief advisor to the crown, and his eyes swept over Elena with an assessment so cold and clinical that she felt the urge to shrink away from it, though she forced herself to stand straight instead. "So you're the tribute," Servin said, circling her slowly, studying her the way one might study livestock at a market. "The Ashford pack certainly knows how to make an impression." A bonded mate, freely given. Bold. Desperate, but bold. I wasn't given freely, Elena said, before she could stop herself. I was given against my will. Servan's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. How refreshingly honest. Most gifts arrive pretending gratitude. Yours arrives with teeth. I suppose we shall see which serves you better here. He gestured for the guards to remove her chains, which they did, and Elena rubbed at her raw wrists, grateful for the relief, but wary of the sudden gentleness, after days of being treated as cargo. You will meet the king this evening, Servin continued, already turning toward the door, clearly considering the conversation finished. I would advise you to be careful with your honesty in his presence. He is not what he once was, and this court does not react well to surprises. He paused at the threshold, glancing back at her with an expression Elena could not quite read. Whether that is a warning or a piece of useful advice, you may decide for yourself. How long have you served him? Elena asked, before Servin could fully leave the room, surprising herself with the question. He paused at the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. Longer than you have been alive, girl. I served his father before him, and I will likely serve whatever comes after, assuming there is anything left of this kingdom to serve. Something bitter passed over his face, quickly smoothed away. You arrive at an unfortunate time. This court has spent years bracing for an ending none of us wanted to imagine. I would not expect a warm welcome, whatever tales the Ashford pack told you before they sent you here. They didn't tell me anything, Elena said. They didn't think I deserved an explanation. Servin studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his sharp eyes. No, he said finally. I don't suppose they did. Pack politics rarely concern themselves with the comfort of the pieces being moved across the board. He inclined his head slightly, an oddly formal gesture. Rest while you can. The evening will come whether you are ready for it or not. The door closed behind him, and the sound of a bolt sliding into place on the other side told Elena, in case she had any doubt remaining, that she was still very much a prisoner, chains or no chains. Left alone once more, Elena allowed herself, for the first time since the chains had closed around her wrists 3 days earlier, to simply breathe. She pressed her palms against her eyes and let the exhaustion of the journey settle over her, the grief for the life she had believed she was building with Killian, the fear of what waited ahead with a king rumored to be rotting from some incurable illness, the anger that still burned hot and steady beneath everything else. She thought of Killian's face turned away from her, of Corwin Ashford's cold assessment, of an entire pack that had watched her dragged away and said nothing. Whatever waited for her inside this crumbling stronghold, she decided, sitting alone in that faded antechamber, with the last light of afternoon slanting through a narrow window, it could not possibly be worse than what she had already survived. She was wrong about many things that day, but she held on to that thought anyway, because it was the only thing keeping her spine straight, and because some stubborn, unbroken part of her refused to believe that her story was already finished. It had, in fact, only just begun. Elena did not sleep that night, though someone had eventually brought her to a small chamber with a narrow bed and left her alone with a single candle for light. She sat by the window instead, watching the darkness settle over the courtyard below, listening to the distant sound of wind moving through broken shutters somewhere in the castle. Every so often she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her door, unhurried, almost aimless, as though whoever walked those halls had nowhere particular to be, and no urgency driving them there. It was such a strange thing, she thought, to be held captive in a place that felt less like a fortress under the command of a fearsome king, and more like a house quietly waiting for something to end. A servant came for her just after sunrise, a thin, older woman named Marta who moved through the room with brisk efficiency, laying out a simple gray dress and instructing Elena to wash and dress quickly. Marta said little beyond what was necessary, but Elena noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and the way her eyes kept flicking toward the door, as if expecting someone to appear and demand an explanation for the delay. Is he truly as ill as they say? Elena asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. Marta's hands stilled for a moment on the laces of the dress. Worse, she said quietly, not meeting Elena's eyes. Though we are forbidden from saying so plainly, you will see for yourself soon enough. Try not to show your shock. He does not care for pity, and he has had enough of it to last several lifetimes. Before Elena could ask anything further, the door opened and 2 guards entered, informing her that the king was ready to receive her. Marta stepped back immediately, her expression closing off into careful neutrality, and Elena understood that whatever brief moment of honesty had passed between them was over now, folded away behind the same guarded caution that seemed to govern everyone in this castle. She followed the guards through a maze of corridors, each one more silent and shadowed than the last. The castle, she realized as she walked, told its own story in the details most people would overlook. Cobwebs gathered undisturbed in high corners. Tapestries hung crooked, as though no one had the energy left to straighten them. Doors stood closed along the length of every hallway, and Elena could not shake the feeling that many of those rooms had not been opened in a very long time. This was not simply a court in mourning for a king who had not yet died. This was a household that had been slowly, quietly giving up, room by room, for longer than anyone wanted to admit. The guards stopped before a set of tall double doors carved with the image of a wolf beneath a crown, the wood dulled with age but still bearing traces of gold leaf along the edges. One of the guards knocked twice, waited for a response Elena could not hear, and then pushed the doors open, gesturing for her to step inside. The chamber beyond was vast, built for grandeur, with high arched windows that should have flooded the room with morning light. Instead, heavy curtains had been drawn across most of them, leaving the space dim and shadowed, lit only by a scattering of candles and the low glow of a fireplace along the far wall. Elena's eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the faded richness of the room, the dust that had settled over furniture clearly once beautiful, before finally settling on the figure seated near the fire. King Draven Nightshade did not rise to greet her. He sat in a heavy wooden chair, angled toward the fire, and even from across the room, Elena could see what the rumors had only hinted at. His skin, where it was visible above his collar and along his hands, bore dark, spreading marks, like bruises that never healed. Veins visible beneath the surface, in shades of black and deep purple, that had no business existing in a living body. He was still, unmistakably, a powerful man, broad through the shoulders, his presence filling the room even seated and still, but there was an exhaustion carved into every line of his face that spoke of years spent fighting something no sword could cut and no strategy could outmaneuver. "So," he said, his voice low and rough, carrying easily across the quiet room, despite its quietness. "You are the tribute the Ashford pack has sent me." Elena straightened her spine, refusing to let her voice shake. "I am a person," she said, "not a tribute." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, and Elena wondered if she had made a grave mistake, speaking so boldly to a king whose reputation, however faded now, had once made entire packs tremble. But then, unexpectedly, something shifted in Draven's expression, something that might almost have been the ghost of amusement. "A fair correction," he said. "Forgive me. I have grown accustomed to the way my court speaks of these arrangements, and I forget, sometimes, that the arrangements involve actual people, rather than pieces on a board." He gestured toward a chair near the fire, though the movement seemed to cost him some effort. "Sit, if you wish. I promise, I have no intention of harming you." Elena hesitated, studying him carefully, before finally crossing the room and lowering herself into the offered chair, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire, but far enough to maintain some sense of distance. Up close, the marks along his skin looked even more unsettling, and she found herself fighting the urge to stare, remembering Marta's warning about pity. "You do not seem surprised," Draven observed, watching her with sharp, tired eyes. "Most who see me for the first time struggle to hide their reaction. You have not asked what is wrong with me." "I assumed you would tell me if you wanted me to know," Elena said, "and if you didn't want me to know, asking would only make things uncomfortable for both of us." Something in his expression eased, just slightly. "Practical," he said. "I appreciate practical people. This court has grown rather thin on them in recent years." He shifted in his chair, wincing faintly at whatever discomfort the movement caused him. "I am dying, if you want the plain truth of it, slowly, and in a manner none of my healers have been able to explain or reverse. It has been 3 years since the first marks appeared. I am told, by those brave enough to be honest with me, that I likely have a matter of months remaining, perhaps less." Elena absorbed this information quietly, searching for the right response, and finding none of the usual platitudes adequate. "I'm sorry," she said finally, simply, because it was true regardless of everything else surrounding her arrival here. Draven studied her for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether her sympathy was genuine or merely another performance, the kind he had likely grown used to receiving from a court, desperate to remain in his favor for whatever time he had left. "You may be the first person in this castle to say that, without wanting something from me in return," he said finally. "That is either very refreshing or very foolish. I have not yet decided which." "Perhaps it's both," Elena said, and to her surprise, a low, rough sound, that might have been a laugh, escaped him, quickly suppressed, but unmistakably real. "Perhaps," he agreed. He studied her a moment longer, his sharp eyes taking in details she could not guess at, before he spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost weary. "I did not ask for a tribute, you understand. Lord Servan arranged the request through proper political channels, believing it would secure loyalty from Pacts anxious about what happens to this territory once I am gone. I did not expect the Ashford Pact to send their own son's mate. That was, I imagine, meant to demonstrate a particularly aggressive form of devotion." Elena's jaw tightened. "It demonstrated exactly how little my former pack valued me," she said. "Killian offered me up the same night the bond formed between us. I don't think loyalty to you had much to do with his decision." Draven's expression sharpened slightly, something calculating moving behind his tired eyes. "Ambition, then," he said. "That tracks more closely with what I know of Corwin Ashford's reputation." He was quiet for a moment, studying the fire rather than her. "For what it's worth, you are not obligated to remain confined here as some symbolic prize. I have little use for symbols, in whatever time remains to me. You may consider yourself a guest of this castle, rather than a prisoner, so long as you do not attempt anything foolish." The offer, unexpected as it was, left Elena momentarily speechless. She had braced herself, throughout the entire journey, for cruelty, for demands, for the kind of treatment that pack law technically permitted a king to inflict upon a gifted tribute. Instead, she found herself being offered something that almost resembled freedom, however limited, from a man whose body was visibly failing him, and whose voice, despite its low roughness, carried no trace of the menace she had expected. "Why would you extend that kind of consideration to someone your court sees as a political gift?" she asked carefully. Draven's gaze returned to her, steady and unreadable. "Because I am dying, Elena Voss, and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I have grown tired of pretending the games this court plays around my throne still matter to me, the way they once did." He gestured toward the door, indicating the audience was drawing to a close. "You will be given quarters in the eastern wing, away from the more crowded parts of the castle. Servan will see that you have what you need. Beyond that, I ask only that you use whatever time you spend here wisely, however you choose to define that for yourself." Elena rose slowly from her chair, studying the tired, marked face of the king, who had just upended every expectation she carried into this room. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, though gratitude was the last emotion she had expected to feel toward the man she had been given to, like property only 3 days earlier. As the guards led her from the chamber, Elena glanced back once and found Draven watching her, with an expression she could not name, something caught between curiosity and exhaustion, as though she represented a puzzle he did not have the strength left to fully examine, but could not quite bring himself to ignore either. Whatever waited for her in the eastern wing, whatever the coming days held within these crumbling walls, Elena understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that the rotting king was not at all the monster she had been warned to expect. That understanding, she suspected, was going to complicate everything. The eastern wing turned out to be quieter than the rest of the castle, tucked away behind a narrow corridor lined with tall windows that, unlike most of the others Elena had passed, remained uncovered, allowing pale daylight to spill across the stone floor. Her new quarters consisted of a modest bedroom and a small sitting area, dusty but clean enough, with a single tall bookshelf standing mostly empty against one wall. It was nothing like the grand chambers she imagined a king's tribute might traditionally be given, and Elena found herself grateful for that. Grandeur, she suspected, would only have made the strangeness of her situation harder to bear. A young servant named Rosalind brought her a simple meal that evening, setting the tray down with quick, efficient movements, before hovering near the door, as though uncertain whether she was permitted to linger. "You may sit, if you'd like company," Elena offered, and Rosalind's shoulders relaxed slightly at the invitation. Not many people down here ask for company, Rosalind admitted, perching carefully on the edge of a nearby chair. The eastern wing has been mostly empty for years now. Most of the staff avoid it, feels lonelier than the rest of the castle somehow, even though it's the brightest part. Why has it been empty? Rosalind hesitated, glancing toward the door out of habit before answering. It used to be where the king's family lived, back before. His mother had her rooms just down that corridor. His younger sister too, though she left the territory years before I came to serve here. After the rot started spreading, His Majesty moved his own chambers closer to the healers' quarters, easier for them to reach him quickly if something worsened in the night. No one saw much reason to keep this wing maintained after that. Elena absorbed this quietly, looking around the room with new understanding. This was not simply an isolated corner of the castle chosen at random. It was a place that had once held warmth and family, now left to gather dust, because the man who might have filled it with life again was too busy surviving to remember what living well even looked like anymore. "Does he have any family left?" she asked. "Besides his sister, wherever she is now." "No one close," Rosalind said. "His parents passed years ago, before the rot even began. His sister writes sometimes, I'm told, though she hasn't visited in a long while. There's talk she blames herself for not staying, though I couldn't say if that's true, or just servants' gossip filling silence where facts should be." She stood, gathering the empty dishes Elena had already finished. "You should rest. Lord Servan tends to expect an early start from anyone new to the household, tribute or otherwise." After Rosalind left, Elena sat by the window for a long while, watching the last traces of daylight fade from the sky above the courtyard, turning the conversation over in her mind. A dying king, with no family close enough to sit beside him, a court full of people too frightened or too calculating to offer him anything resembling honesty, an entire wing of the castle left hollow and forgotten because grief had made it easier to abandon than to maintain. She thought of Killian again, briefly, and was almost surprised to find the sharp edge of her anger toward him had dulled slightly, replaced by something closer to numb disbelief that she had ever imagined her life unfolding beside him. Whatever came next within these walls, she understood already that it would look nothing like the future she had once planned. That realization, strangely, did not frighten her as much as it should have. Instead, lying awake much later that night in the narrow bed of a room that had once belonged to a family now scattered or gone, Elena found herself thinking not of everything she had lost, but of the tired, marked face of a king who had spoken to her like a person rather than property, and the unsettling curiosity that conversation had planted somewhere deep beneath her anger. She did not yet understand what any of it meant, but she understood, with the same stubborn certainty that had carried her through 3 days of chains and betrayal, that she intended to find out. 3 days passed before Elena worked up the courage to leave the eastern wing on her own, and even then, she moved carefully through the unfamiliar corridors, half expecting a guard to appear and order her back to her quarters. None did. It seemed, true to Draven's word, that no one in the castle had been instructed to keep her confined, and the freedom of that realization pushed her forward, curiosity overtaking caution as she explored the quieter, less traveled parts of the fortress. She found the library on the 4th day, tucked behind an unmarked door at the end of a corridor she had never walked before. It was smaller than she expected, given the size of the rest of the castle, but the shelves rose high toward a vaulted ceiling, packed with books and scrolls that clearly had not been touched in a very long time. A thick layer of dust coated most surfaces, and the air smelled of old paper and neglect, but something about the room felt different from the rest of the castle's decay. It felt less like abandonment and more like waiting, as though the room itself understood that someone would eventually come looking for whatever answers it held. Elena spent that first afternoon simply exploring the shelves, running her fingers along cracked leather spines, pulling down volumes at random to study their contents. Most were histories of the territory, records of pack alliances long since dissolved, genealogies tracing bloodlines back further than she could easily follow. It was slow, tedious work, made harder by handwriting faded nearly to illegibility in some of the older texts, but Elena found herself oddly comforted by the task. It gave her something to focus on besides the strange, unsettled feeling that had followed her since her conversation with Draven, the sense that there was more to understand about this castle and its dying king than anyone within these walls seemed willing to explain plainly. It was on the 6th day, deep in a section of shelving she had not yet explored, that Elena found the journal. It was small, bound in cracked brown leather, tucked behind a row of larger books as though someone had deliberately hidden it rather than simply shelved it. The handwriting inside was neat and careful, clearly the work of someone trained in medicine or healing, and the entries, once Elena began reading, painted a picture that made her pulse quicken, with something between excitement and dread. The journal belonged, according to its opening pages, to a healer named Corin Ashwood, who had served the Nightshade royal family 2 generations earlier, during the reign of Draven's grandfather. Most of the early entries were mundane, records of injuries treated, remedies prepared, the ordinary business of caring for a royal household. But partway through, the tone shifted, and Elena found herself leaning closer to the faded ink, reading passages that described a series of strange, unexplained illnesses affecting members of the Nightshade bloodline across multiple generations. Illnesses that began, according to Corin's careful notes, shortly after what he referred to only as the Broken Pact. The healer's entries grew increasingly urgent as they continued, describing his growing suspicion that the illnesses were not natural in origin at all, but connected somehow to an old agreement made generations earlier between the Nightshade bloodline and another pack whose name had been deliberately left blank throughout the entire journal, as though even writing it down carried some kind of risk. Corin theorized, in increasingly frantic handwriting toward the journal's final pages, that the pack's breaking had triggered some manner of curse tied specifically to the bloodline, one that would resurface generation after generation until the original terms of the agreement were somehow honored or reversed. The final entry, dated only a few months before what Elena assumed must have been the healer's death or dismissal, given the journal's abrupt ending, read simply, "I have brought my findings to the king, and I have been instructed never to speak of this again. I fear I have uncovered something this family would rather bury than face. I pray whatever comes for the next generation, find someone braver than I proved to be." Elena sat back against the shelf, the journal open in her lap, her mind racing through the implications. If Corin Ashwood's suspicions held any truth, then Draven's rot was not simply an unexplained illness, the kind that healers occasionally encountered and could not cure despite their best efforts. It might be something far older and far more deliberate, a consequence still unfolding from a broken promise made long before Draven himself had even been born. She spent the rest of that day and much of the following one searching the library for any further mention of the pact Corin had referenced, but found nothing more specific, only scattered references throughout older histories to alliances formed and broken across the territory's long, complicated past. Frustrated but unwilling to let the discovery go, Elena finally decided she needed to bring what she had found to the one person who might actually know something useful about his own family's history. She requested an audience with Draven the following morning, and to her surprise, was granted one within the hour. She found him in the same chamber as before, seated near the fire despite the mild weather outside, a heavy blanket draped across his knees that had not been there during their first meeting. The marks along his visible skin looked, if anything, slightly darker than they had a week earlier, and Elena felt a fresh pang of urgency at the sight. "You look like someone with news," Draven observed as she entered, studying her face with the same sharp attention she remembered from their first conversation. "Should I be concerned, or merely curious?" "Both, possibly," Elena said, and without further preamble, she explained what she had found in the library, describing Corin Ashwood's journal and its unsettling theory about a broken pact and a curse tied to the bloodline, watching Draven's expression carefully as she spoke. He listened without interrupting, his face giving away little until she finished, at which point a long, heavy silence settled over the room. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than she had heard it before. "My father spoke of something similar once, very briefly, in a conversation I was not meant to overhear. I was young, perhaps 12 years old, and I did not understand enough of what he said to make sense of it at the time. He mentioned an old debt, something owed by our bloodline to another pack, long since scattered or destroyed. He never spoke of it again, and I assumed, as children often do, that I had simply misunderstood an adult conversation that carried no real weight." "What if you didn't misunderstand it?" Elena asked. "What if this rot isn't simply illness, but something tied to whatever debt your father mentioned?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression Elena could not fully read, something caught between hope and exhaustion, as though he had learned, over years of failed treatments and false promises from healers desperate to please him, not to trust hope too quickly. "Every healer who has examined me has found nothing," he said finally. "No illness, no poison, no natural explanation for what is happening to my body. If this is truly some manner of curse rather than sickness, it would at least explain why nothing conventional has been able to touch it." "Then let me help you find out," Elena said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "I have time. I have access to your library, and frankly, I have very little else to occupy myself with in this castle." Draven studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, an expression that looked almost like the early, cautious stages of hope. "Why would you offer this?" he asked. "You owe this bloodline nothing. If anything, you have every reason to resent the position my crown has placed you in, however unwillingly on both our parts." Elena considered the question seriously before answering. "Because I spent my whole life believing certain things mattered: loyalty, bonds, promises made and kept. All of that turned out to be worth very little when it was tested. But I still believe those things should matter, even if the people around me stopped believing it. If there's a way to fix whatever is happening to you, I would rather spend my time here searching for it than sitting alone in an empty wing, waiting for something worse to happen." Something in Draven's expression softened, just slightly, the ghost of an emotion he seemed unpracticed at showing. "Then I accept your help, gladly," he said, "though I would ask that you be careful who you discuss this with. If Lord Servin or others in this court learn we are pursuing theories about curses and broken pacts, it may create complications neither of us have the strength to manage right now." Over the following weeks, a strange new rhythm settled into Elena's days. Mornings were spent in the library, sifting through old records, cross-referencing names and dates, searching for any further mention of the mysterious pact Corin Ashwood's journal had hinted at. Afternoons, more often than not, found her in Draven's chamber, sharing whatever fragments of information she had uncovered, the two of them slowly piecing together a puzzle neither fully understood yet. Their conversations, Elena noticed, began stretching beyond the research itself. Draven asked her questions about her life before the castle, about growing up in the Ashford pack, about the mother she had lost, and the childhood friendships that had once meant so much to her. In turn, Elena found herself curious about the king behind the crown, the boy he had once been, before illness and duty had worn him down into the tired, guarded man seated across from her most afternoons. She learned he had once loved climbing the tallest trees near the castle as a child, much to his mother's constant alarm. She learned he had a dry, understated sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly during their research sessions, catching her off guard into genuine laughter more than once. It was during one such afternoon, several weeks into their search, that Elena looked up from an old genealogical record spread across the table between them, and realized, with a jolt of surprise, that she had stopped thinking of Draven Nightshade as the rotting king she had been given to like property. She had started, somewhere along the way, thinking of him simply as Draven, a person whose company she had come to genuinely look forward to, whose sharp mind and quiet resilience she had come to respect, in a way she had not expected, when the chains first closed around her wrists so many weeks earlier. She did not know yet what that shift meant, or where it might lead, but she recognized it for what it was, a change too significant to ignore, and she carried that recognition with her, as the weeks continued to pass, the two of them drawing slowly closer to answers neither had expected to find, and closer to each other, in ways neither had planned for at all. The first real crisis came on a night Elena would remember for a long time afterward, weeks into their quiet partnership, when a sudden commotion in the corridor outside her quarters pulled her from sleep well past midnight. She dressed quickly, following the sound of hurried footsteps and low, urgent voices toward the king's wing, a cold dread settling into her stomach with every step. She found Rosalind near the entrance to Draven's chamber, wringing her hands, her face pale in the dim candlelight of the hallway. "His Majesty collapsed just after the healers left for the evening," she explained quickly. "One of the guards found him on the floor near the fireplace. They've called for the physicians again, but I don't know if there's anything left for them to try." Elena did not wait for permission. She pushed past the guards stationed outside the chamber door, ignoring their startled protests, and found Draven exactly where Rosalind had described, propped against the base of his chair by two anxious attendants, his breathing shallow and uneven, sweat beading along his forehead despite the coolness of the room. The dark marks along his skin had spread visibly since she had seen him only hours earlier, creeping now along the side of his neck in thin, branching lines that looked disturbingly like something alive beneath the surface. "Get him back into the chair, carefully," Elena instructed the attendants, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice, even as panic clawed at the edges of her thoughts. Together they eased Draven upright, and Elena knelt beside him, taking one of his hands in both of hers, feeling how cold his fingers had become despite the warmth of the room. "You shouldn't be here," Draven managed, his voice barely more than a rough whisper, though the faintest trace of stubborn humor still clung to the words. "This is hardly the sort of company a person should keep." "Be quiet," Elena said, though there was no real force behind the words, only fear, thinly disguised as sternness. "Save your energy for staying alive, not for making jokes at a time like this." The physicians arrived shortly after, moving through their familiar, practiced routine of examination and treatment, though Elena could see in their faces the same weary resignation she had noticed in nearly everyone else who served this dying king, the look of people who had run out of new ideas long ago, and were now simply going through motions, because stopping felt like giving up entirely. They administered what remedies they had, none of which, Elena understood from the journal she had spent weeks studying, stood any real chance of addressing whatever was truly happening beneath Draven's skin. She stayed by his side through the worst of it, long after the physicians had exhausted their limited treatments and retreated to allow the king some rest, refusing every suggestion from concerned attendants that she return to her own quarters for the night. She sat in a chair pulled close beside his bed, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest, and found herself, somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, praying to whatever old wolf spirits her grandmother had once told her still watched over bonded packs, asking for time, simply more time, enough to find whatever answer Corin Ashwood's journal had hinted at before it became too late to matter. Draven's condition stabilized, eventually, sometime near sunrise, his breathing evening out into something closer to normal sleep, though the dark marks along his neck remained, a visible reminder of how close the night had come to ending very differently. Elena finally allowed herself to be persuaded back to her own quarters as the sun rose, but sleep would not come, her mind circling endlessly around the fear she had felt watching him struggle for breath, and the unsettling realization of just how much that fear had revealed about her own feelings she had not yet found the courage to examine too closely. 2 days later, once Draven had regained enough strength to receive visitors again, Elena returned to their research with renewed urgency, driven now by something sharper than simple curiosity. She spent long hours in the library, barely pausing to eat, cross-referencing every genealogical record she could find against the vague hints scattered throughout Corin Ashwood's journal. It was during one of these exhausting sessions that she finally found something concrete, tucked within the pages of an old ceremonial record, describing a gathering of packs, held generations earlier, to formalize a series of alliances across the territory. The record was incomplete, water damage having destroyed much of the text, but Elena could make out enough to identify a specific ceremony, one involving an exchange of vows between the Nightshade bloodline and a pack whose name had been carefully scratched out throughout the entire document, the same deliberate erasure she had noticed in Corin's journal. Whatever pact had been broken, whoever the Nightshade family had wronged, someone had gone to considerable effort to remove every trace of the other pack's identity from the historical record, a level of deliberate erasure that struck Elena as far more suspicious than simple accident or the ordinary decay of old documents. She brought her discovery to Draven the following afternoon, finding him recovered enough to sit upright without assistance, though still visibly weaker than he had been before the crisis. He studied the damaged record carefully, his expression grim as he traced the scratched-out portions with one careful finger. "Someone wanted this erased," he said quietly, deliberately, and thoroughly enough that whoever did it clearly did not want future generations discovering the truth of whatever happened. "Which raises an obvious question," Elena said. "What was your family trying to hide, and from whom?" Draven met her eyes, something grim and determined settling into his expression despite his obvious exhaustion. "I do not know yet," he admitted, "but I intend to find out, whatever strength it costs me to do so." I have spent 3 years slowly dying without understanding why. I would rather spend whatever time remains fighting toward an answer than simply waiting for the end to arrive. Elena reached across the space between them and covered his hand with hers, a gesture that surprised them both with its simple, unguarded sincerity. Then we'll find it together, she said. Whatever it takes. Draven looked down at their joined hands for a long moment, something unspoken passing behind his tired eyes, before finally looking back up to meet her gaze. Together, he agreed, and though the word was quiet, it carried a weight that neither of them fully understood yet. A promise neither had planned to make, but neither seemed inclined to take back. That evening, walking back toward the eastern wing through the quiet corridors of the castle, Elena passed a narrow window overlooking the courtyard below, and paused, watching the last light fade from the sky. She thought of Killian, briefly, the way she still sometimes did in unguarded moments, though the memory carried less sting now than it once had, softened by weeks of distance, and by the strange, unexpected life she had built for herself within these crumbling walls. She thought of the frightened, chained woman who had arrived here weeks earlier, certain her story had already reached its worst possible chapter, and she marveled quietly at how much had changed since then, how a place that had once felt like a prison now felt, in small and surprising ways, almost like the beginning of something she had never expected to find. She did not yet know what waited ahead, what dangers still lurked within a court she had only begun to understand, or what the broken pact and its lingering curse would eventually demand of both of them before this was finished. But standing there in the quiet hallway, watching darkness settle gently over the courtyard, Elena felt something she had not expected to feel again so soon after everything she had lost, a fragile, stubborn thread of hope, and beneath it, something even more surprising, the quiet beginnings of a bond she had never asked for, but was no longer certain she wanted to refuse. Lord Servin found Elena in the library 4 days later, standing over a table scattered with old records, and the sight of him in the doorway sent a small jolt of alarm through her, before she managed to compose her expression into something neutral. He had never sought her out directly before, and something about the deliberate way he closed the door behind him told her this visit was not accidental. "You've been spending a great deal of time down here," he observed, moving slowly along the nearest shelf, running one finger through a thin layer of dust, as though inspecting it for evidence of something. "And a great deal of time in the king's chambers as well, I'm told. Quite an active schedule for someone who arrived here in chains only a few months ago." "I was told I was free to occupy my time as I chose," Elena said carefully, keeping her voice even, despite the wariness tightening in her chest. "Indeed you were," Servin agreed, his tone pleasant enough on the surface, though something colder ran beneath it. "I simply find myself curious. What exactly occupies so much of it? Old genealogies, ceremonial records, peculiar reading material for a young woman with no formal education in history. Wouldn't you agree?" Elena kept her expression carefully blank, unwilling to reveal how close his observation had come to the truth. "I find the history of this territory interesting," she said. "Is that a crime now, within these walls?" Servin's sharp eyes lingered on her a moment longer, before he offered a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Not a crime," he said, "merely worth noting. This court has survived a great many years by paying close attention to small details others might overlook. I have found that habit serves me well, even when the details in question ultimately prove innocent." He moved toward the door, pausing once more before leaving. "The king's health has always been a delicate matter, Miss Voss. I would advise caution in whatever theories you might be forming about its cause. Some questions are better left unasked, for everyone's sake." The warning, delivered so smoothly, and yet so unmistakably, left Elena unsettled long after Servin had gone. She said nothing to Draven about the encounter immediately, uncertain how much weight to give it, but the memory of his cold, assessing gaze stayed with her over the following days, a quiet reminder that whatever progress she and Draven were making toward understanding the curse, they were not operating in a space free of watchful eyes and hidden agendas. Despite the unease Servin's visit had planted, Elena's research continued, and within the week, it finally began to yield something substantial. Buried deep within a collection of old letters preserved in a locked cabinet at the back of the library, one Elena had needed considerable effort to pry open. She found correspondence between Draven's grandfather and an unnamed pack leader, dated decades before Draven's own birth. The letters were guarded in their language, clearly written by men accustomed to concealing meaning behind careful diplomatic phrasing. But reading between the formal courtesies, Elena began to piece together a story that matched, disturbingly well, the fragments Corin Ashwood's journal had hinted at so many weeks earlier. The letters described an agreement, a pact sealed generations ago between the Nightshade bloodline and a smaller, less powerful pack, whose territory had once bordered the Nightshade lands to the north. In exchange for military protection and political backing that had allowed the smaller pack to survive threats from more aggressive neighbors, that pack's leader had agreed to bind his own bloodline in service to the Nightshade throne, a formal pact sealed through ritual magic, old even by the standards of that generation, magic tied deeply to blood and bone, and the honor of a wolf's given word. The final letter in the collection, dated only months before it abruptly stopped, described a violent falling out between the two pack leaders, details deliberately vague, though the tone carried an unmistakable undercurrent of betrayal and rage. Draven's grandfather, it seemed, had broken the terms of the original agreement, abandoning the smaller pack to a threat he had sworn to help defend against, a threat that ultimately destroyed that pack entirely, scattering its surviving members and erasing its name from the territory's maps within a single generation. Elena sat back from the letters, her pulse racing, pieces of the larger puzzle finally beginning to click into place. A broken vow, a pact sealed through blood magic, abandoned and betrayed, a bloodline left utterly destroyed by that betrayal. It was not difficult to imagine that a curse, powerful enough to reach across generations and settle itself into Draven's very body, might have been the price demanded for such a profound violation of trust. She brought the letters to Draven immediately, watching his face carefully as he read through them, his expression growing darker with every line. When he finally looked up, something raw and pained had settled into his tired eyes, an emotion Elena had not seen from him before, something closer to shame than the exhaustion he usually carried so carefully guarded. "My grandfather did this," he said quietly, his voice rough with a mixture of anger and grief. "He made a vow, sealed it with magic, old enough to bind an entire bloodline, and then abandoned that same pact to destruction, the moment protecting them became inconvenient to his own ambitions." He set the letters down carefully, as though they had suddenly become too heavy to hold. "Whatever curse settled into my blood as a result, I have been paying for a crime I did not commit, inherited through no choice or fault of my own." "That's often how curses work," Elena said gently, though she understood the injustice of it stung, regardless of logic. "They rarely care whether the person suffering deserves the punishment. They care only about the debt owed." Draven was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fire with an expression Elena could not fully read. "If a debt is truly owed," he said finally, "then perhaps the only way to end this curse is to somehow repay it. Though I confess I have no idea what such repayment would even look like, given that the pack my grandfather betrayed no longer exists to receive it." Elena considered this carefully, her mind already turning back toward the library and the countless records still waiting to be searched. "Then we find out what happened to whatever survivors remained," she said. "Someone from that bloodline might still exist somewhere in this territory, scattered though they may be. If we can find them, perhaps there's a way to make amends, even generations later." Something in Draven's expression shifted, a fragile, cautious hope breaking through the shame and exhaustion that had settled over him moments earlier. "You truly believe that's possible?" he asked. "I believe it's worth trying," Elena said honestly. "You have little to lose by searching, and everything to gain if we're right." Over the following weeks, their research shifted focus, moving from the origins of the curse toward tracing whatever remained of the betrayed pack's scattered bloodline. It was slow, painstaking work, made harder by the deliberate erasure someone, likely Draven's grandfather himself, had clearly worked to impose on the historical record. But Elena refused to let the difficulty discourage her, driven now by more than simple curiosity, or even the growing bond she felt toward Draven. She had begun to understand, deeply and personally, what it meant to be discarded by someone who should have protected you, to be treated as expendable in service of someone else's ambition. If there was any way to help right that old wrong, any way to ease the suffering it had caused across generations, she intended to find it, whatever the search demanded of her. Draven, for his part, grew visibly stronger during these weeks of shared purpose, Not physically, the marks along his skin remained as dark and unsettling as ever, but in spirit, a fire returning to his tired eyes that Elena suspected had been absent for a very long time before her arrival. He began joining her more often in the library itself, rather than simply receiving reports of her findings in his chamber. The two of them working side by side late into the evening, their conversations drifting increasingly beyond the research at hand, into quieter, more personal territory that neither of them seemed inclined to interrupt. It was during one such evening, the library lit only by a scattering of candles as darkness settled fully outside the tall windows, that Draven looked up from the record he had been studying and caught Elena watching him, an expression on her face she had not intended for him to see so plainly. "What is it?" he asked, setting the record aside. Elena hesitated, unsure how to explain the quiet realization that had been building within her for weeks now, ever since that terrifying night when fear for his life had revealed feelings she had not been ready to name. "I was thinking," she said finally, choosing her words carefully, "about how strange it is that the worst night of my life led me somehow to this. To you. To feeling like I have a purpose again, after everything that happened before I arrived here." Draven's expression softened, something vulnerable and unguarded, breaking through the careful composure he usually maintained. "I have thought something similar," he admitted quietly, "though I have been hesitant to say so aloud, given everything hanging over both our heads. A dying king is hardly a fair burden to place on anyone, whatever feelings might be growing between us." "Let me decide what burdens I'm willing to carry," Elena said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand, the same gesture she had offered him weeks earlier during his crisis, though it carried a different weight now, quieter and more certain. "I chose to stay and search for answers. I choose, now, to stay for other reasons as well." Draven studied her for a long moment, something fragile and hopeful settling into his expression, before he finally spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Then perhaps," he said, "we should continue searching together, and see where that choice eventually leads us both." Neither of them spoke of it further that night, the moment settling quietly between them as they returned to their work. But something had shifted, unmistakably, in the space between their two chairs, a warmth that had nothing to do with the candles or the fireplace, and everything to do with a bond neither of them had chosen, but both, increasingly, found themselves unwilling to walk away from. News of Elena's growing closeness to the king did not stay contained within the library and his private chambers for long, however carefully they believed themselves to be guarding the shift taking place between them. Servants noticed, as servants always did, the way Draven's mood had lightened in recent weeks, the way he asked after Elena when she was late arriving for their afternoon sessions, the way laughter, however rare and rough from disuse, had begun to occasionally drift from behind his chamber doors. Word traveled quickly through a household starved for anything resembling good news, and within a matter of days, quiet whispers had begun circulating among the staff, whispers that inevitably reached ears less friendly than Rosalind's or Marta's. Elena first sensed the shift in atmosphere during a meal in the smaller dining hall, reserved for the castle's senior staff, where she had begun taking her meals rather than eating alone in her quarters. Conversations quieted slightly when she entered the room, glances exchanged between servants that carried more curiosity than hostility, though Elena could not entirely shake the feeling of being watched, assessed, discussed in her absence. She said nothing of this discomfort to Draven, unwilling to burden him with concerns that felt, in comparison to the curse still slowly killing him, relatively minor. But minor concerns, she was beginning to learn within these walls, had a way of growing into significant ones if left unattended for too long, and the quiet whispers following her through the castle corridors were, she suspected, only the earliest signs of complications neither she nor Draven had yet begun to properly prepare for. The accusation arrived on a gray morning, delivered without warning by two guards who appeared at the entrance to the eastern wing, and requested, in tones too formal to be mistaken for anything but trouble, that Elena accompany them to the great hall immediately. She followed them through corridors that felt suddenly colder than usual, her mind racing through every possible explanation, none of them reassuring. The great hall, when she reached it, was already occupied by a small gathering of the castle's senior court, Lord Servan standing at the center of the room, with an expression of grave concern that did not quite mask the satisfaction flickering beneath it. "Elena Voss," Servin said, as she entered, his voice carrying easily across the hall, pitched for the benefit of the small audience, gathered to witness whatever was about to unfold. You stand accused of maintaining correspondence with agents of the Ashford Pack, the very pack that sent you here as tribute. Correspondence that suggests you have been gathering information about the king's condition to relay back to your former pack, information they might use to their advantage once the throne changes hands. The accusation landed like a physical blow, so absurd, and yet so carefully constructed, that for a moment, Elena could only stare at Servin in disbelief. "That's a lie," she said finally, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear tightening in her chest. "I have sent no correspondence to anyone. I have had no contact with the Ashford Pack since the night I was dragged from my home in chains." "And yet," Servin continued smoothly, gesturing to a folded piece of parchment held by one of the guards, "this letter was discovered in the possession of a stable hand who claims you paid him to deliver it beyond the castle walls. The handwriting bears a striking resemblance to samples taken from your personal effects." Elena's stomach twisted with cold dread as the guard unfolded the letter and held it up for the gathered court to see, though he kept it too far away for her to examine closely herself. The handwriting, from what little she could make out at that distance, did look unsettlingly similar to her own, careful, and slanted in a way that felt deliberately, cruelly familiar. "I never wrote that," she said, though she could hear how hollow the denial sounded against the weight of physical evidence being presented so confidently before witnesses who did not know her well enough to simply take her word over Servin's careful staging. "Whoever forged this wanted exactly this outcome, to make me look guilty of something I had no part in." "A convenient claim," Servin said, though his tone remained maddeningly pleasant, given the circumstances. "Just might. Perhaps His Majesty's advisors should consider whether a woman with such close ties to the pack that so recently discarded her can truly be trusted so near the throne, however sympathetic her situation might appear on the surface." Word of the accusation reached Draven within the hour, and he arrived in the great hall moving faster than Elena had seen him move in weeks, his weakened body clearly straining with the effort, but his expression carrying an authority that silenced the murmuring court the moment he crossed the threshold. "Explain this," he said to Servin, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Elena had not heard from him before, a hint of the powerful ruler he must once have been breaking through the exhaustion that usually softened his presence. Servin recounted the accusation smoothly, presenting the letter once more, and Draven studied it carefully, his jaw tightening as he examined the handwriting for himself. "This is a forgery," he said after a long moment, his voice carrying certainty that made several members of the gathered court shift uncomfortably. "I have read enough of Elena's notes and correspondence over these past weeks to recognize her hand clearly. This is close enough to fool a casual glance, but the loops on these letters are wrong. Whoever crafted this made an error, however small." "With respect, Your Majesty," Servin said carefully, though something tighter had entered his voice now. "Even the most convincing evidence can be dismissed by those unwilling to see it clearly. I would only ask that the court consider the timing of these events, and the considerable influence Miss Voss has gained over Your Majesty's decisions in recent weeks." The implication hung heavy in the air, and Elena understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what Servin was truly accusing her of. Not espionage on behalf of a pack that had already discarded her, but something closer to manipulation, undue influence over a dying king, whose favor Servin himself likely hoped to secure once the throne inevitably passed to someone new. The forged letter was simply the mechanism, a convenient excuse to remove an obstacle that had begun threatening whatever plans Servin had quietly been constructing for the eventual transition of power. "I have gained no influence over the king, beyond what any advisor with useful information might offer," Elena said, drawing herself up despite the fear still tight in her chest, refusing to let it show in her voice. "If Lord Servin finds that threatening, perhaps he should examine more closely why the truth unsettles him so deeply." A ripple of surprised murmuring passed through the gathered court at her boldness, and Servin's carefully pleasant expression flickered, just briefly, into something sharper before he composed himself again. "Bold words," he said, "from a tribute accused of treason." "Enough," Draven said, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension building in the hall. "I have examined the evidence myself, and found it wanting. Elena Voss will face no punishment based on a forged letter and unfounded suspicion. This matter is closed." He turned his sharp gaze directly on Servin, something cold and unmistakably warning in his expression. I would advise whoever crafted this forgery to consider carefully whether continuing down this path serves them well, given how easily its flaws have already been exposed. Servin bowed his head in careful, formal acknowledgement, though the tightness around his eyes told Elena the matter was far from truly settled in his mind, whatever the official ruling had declared. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said smoothly. "I only ever seek to protect the throne's interests, however imperfectly that duty is sometimes carried out." The gathered court dispersed slowly afterward, the tension in the hall easing only gradually as people filtered back toward their usual duties, though Elena noticed the lingering glances thrown her way, some curious, some still faintly suspicious, despite Draven's clear ruling in her favor. Rumors, she understood, were rarely so easily dismissed once planted, however thoroughly the specific accusation behind them had been disproven. Draven found her afterward in a quiet alcove off the main hall, where she had retreated to steady her still racing pulse, and he studied her carefully, concern etched clearly into his tired features. "Are you all right?" he asked, reaching out to gently take her hand. "I will be," Elena said, though her voice still carried a slight tremor she could not entirely suppress. "Though I confess I did not expect to be accused of treason quite so soon into my time here." "Servin has grown desperate," Draven said grimly. "He has spent years positioning himself to hold significant power once I am gone, whether through influence over whichever distant relative might eventually claim the throne, or through some other arrangement entirely. Your growing importance to me threatens whatever plans he has quietly been constructing, and desperate men rarely limit themselves to honest tactics when their ambitions feel threatened." "What happens now?" Elena asked. "He knows his forgery failed. Won't he simply try something else?" Draven's expression darkened further, though he did not release her hand, his grip instead tightening slightly, a small, unconscious gesture of protectiveness that Elena found herself grateful for, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. "Likely," he admitted. "I do not yet know what form his next attempt will take. But I promise you, Elena, whatever he attempts, I will not allow harm to come to you within these walls, whatever strength I have left to prevent it." The following weeks passed under a new, watchful tension that had not existed before Servin's accusation, Elena finding herself more careful now about where she walked alone, which servants she trusted with information, how openly she and Draven discussed their ongoing research into the broken pact, and the curse still slowly claiming his body. Their partnership continued, undeterred by the failed accusation, but a new awareness had settled over both of them, the understanding that their alliance, whatever it had grown to mean to each of them personally, now existed within a court, actively working against it, watching for the next opportunity to strike more successfully than the first attempt had managed. Despite the growing danger, or perhaps because of it, Elena found herself drawing closer to Draven rather than retreating from the risk, an instinct she did not fully examine, but did not resist either. Their late evenings in the library grew longer, their conversations drifting more frequently into quiet, personal territory that had little to do with broken pacts or ancient curses, and more to do with the fears and hopes each of them carried. Fears about mortality and belonging, hopes for a future that had once seemed entirely foreclosed to both of them, for very different reasons. It was during one such evening, weeks after Servin's failed accusation, that Elena finally allowed herself to fully acknowledge what had been building steadily between them since that terrifying night, when fear for Draven's life had first cracked open feelings she had not been ready to examine. Watching him across the candlelit table, his sharp eyes softened with the particular warmth he reserved only for her now, Elena understood, with a certainty that settled deep and unshakable in her chest, that whatever the original mate bond with Killian had once promised her, whatever future she had once imagined for herself before chains and betrayal rewrote every plan she had carried into that fateful birthday celebration, none of it compared to what she had found within these crumbling castle walls, unplanned and unexpected, growing steadily stronger despite every obstacle a hostile court continued placing in its path. The attack came without warning, on an evening that had, until that point, felt like any other quiet night within the castle walls. Elena was walking back from the library alone, later than usual, the corridors dim, and mostly empty at that hour, when a figure stepped suddenly from the shadows of a side passage, moving with the deliberate speed of someone who had been waiting specifically for her. She had only a moment to register the glint of a blade before instinct took over, twisting away just in time to avoid the worst of the strike, though the edge still caught her arm, a sharp line of pain blooming instantly along her forearm. She cried out, stumbling backward, and the attacker, hooded and silent, advanced again, clearly intent on finishing whatever task he had been sent to complete. Elena's wolf surged forward instinctively, sharp claws replacing fingers, teeth lengthening as raw survival instinct overrode conscious thought, and she managed to drive the attacker back with a fierce, desperate swipe before he could strike again. But he was skilled, clearly trained for exactly this kind of confrontation, and Elena understood with rising panic that she was losing ground, her own combat training limited compared to whatever discipline had shaped her assailant's movements. Then, with a speed and ferocity that seemed to defy his weakened condition entirely, Draven arrived. He must have sensed something was wrong, some instinct, or perhaps the faint thread of the mate bond neither of them had yet dared to name aloud, pulling him from his chambers and through the corridors fast enough to reach her before the attacker could land a fatal strike. His wolf tore free with a violence Elena had never witnessed from him before, dark fur bristling, eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to burn away, however briefly, every trace of the exhaustion that usually weighed down his movements. He struck the attacker with devastating force, driving the man back against the stone wall hard enough to end the confrontation almost instantly, the assailant crumpling unconscious to the floor. Draven shifted back quickly, rushing to Elena's side, his hands gentle despite the barely restrained fury still radiating from him as he examined the cut along her arm. "You're hurt," he said, his voice rough with a mixture of relief and rage. "How badly?" "It's not deep," Elena managed, though her voice shook slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "I'll be all right." But as Draven's hands moved carefully along her injured arm, something extraordinary happened, something neither of them had anticipated. A warmth spread suddenly between them, spreading from the point of contact and radiating outward through Elena's entire body, unmistakable and overwhelming. The same sensation she remembered feeling the night the bond with Killian had first ignited, except stronger now, deeper, carrying a certainty that the bond with Killian had never quite possessed. Draven froze, his eyes widening with sudden understanding, and Elena watched the same recognition dawn across his face that she felt blooming within her own chest. "This isn't possible," he said quietly, though the wonder in his voice contradicted the doubt in his words. "A person cannot carry two mate bonds. The first bond should have prevented this entirely. Unless the first bond was never truly complete," Elena said slowly, understanding arriving alongside the sensation, still humming warmly beneath her skin. "Killian and I bonded, but we never sealed it fully. We never had the chance, before everything fell apart that same night." She looked up at Draven, searching his face with a mixture of hope and disbelief. What if the bond with him was real, but incomplete, and this, whatever is happening between us right now, is the truer connection neither of us recognized until this moment? Draven's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, wonder and fear, and something achingly hopeful all tangled together. "If that's true," he said carefully, "then fate has given me something I never allowed myself to hope for, not since the rot first began spreading through my body, and I resigned myself to dying alone, without ever finding the kind of connection my parents shared before their own deaths." "You're not dying alone," Elena said firmly, reaching up to gently touch his face, the warmth of the bond still humming steadily between them, a quiet, certain thing that felt entirely different from the fragile, incomplete connection she had once shared with Killian. "Whatever happens with the curse, whatever Servan continues to attempt against us, you are not facing any of it alone anymore." Draven leaned into her touch, closing his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, something had settled in his expression, a fierce, protective determination that had not been there before. "Then we face all of it together," he said. "The curse, the danger from Servan, whatever the future demands of us. I will not lose you to whatever schemes this court continues to construct against us. Not now that I understand what I very nearly lost tonight, before even recognizing what you truly meant to me." Guards arrived shortly after, summoned by the noise of the confrontation, and the unconscious attacker was taken into custody for questioning, though Elena suspected, correctly as it would turn out, that whoever had sent him would prove difficult to definitively connect to the attack, however strongly circumstantial evidence might point in an obvious direction. For now, though, Neither she nor Draven allowed the lingering danger to overshadow the significance of what had just been revealed between them. They sat together long into that night, Elena's wound cleaned and bandaged by Rosalind's careful hands, the warmth of the true mate bond settling more comfortably into place between them with every passing hour. And for the first time since chains had closed around her wrists so many months earlier, Elena allowed herself to imagine a future that felt entirely her own to choose, built not on obligation or political convenience, but on something real and freely given, discovered against every possible expectation within the crumbling walls of a castle she had once believed would only ever represent her greatest tragedy. She understood, holding Draven's hand as dawn finally broke over the courtyard outside his chamber window, that the greatest challenges still lay ahead of them, the curse still unbroken, Servan's schemes far from finished, the truth about Killian's betrayal not yet fully revealed. But for that quiet, precious moment, none of it mattered quite as much as the certainty settled warm and steady beneath her ribs, the knowledge that whatever came next, she would not face it alone, and neither, any longer, would he. The captured attacker, questioned over several days by Draven's most trusted guards, eventually revealed a name that sent a fresh wave of shock through Elena when it finally reached her. Not Servan's as she had expected, but a courier connected to communications flowing steadily between the castle and the Ashford Pact territory. Communications that had apparently continued in secret since the night Elena first arrived as tribute. Draven brought her the news personally, his expression grave as he explained what the interrogation had uncovered. The attacker was hired through an intermediary, he said, but the coin used to pay him traces back to a source within the Ashford Pact. It seems Killian has maintained closer interest in your situation here than either of us realized. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. Old wounds she had believed mostly healed, reopening with sudden, unwelcome force. Why would Killian want me dead? She asked. He already discarded me. What could he possibly gain from finishing what he started that night? It took several more days of careful investigation, cross-referencing correspondence, intercepted from the courier network, and pressing the captured attacker for further details, before the full picture finally emerged. And when it did, Elena found herself sitting in stunned, furious silence, as Draven laid out what they had discovered. Killian, it turned out, had known considerably more about Draven's condition than the simple political calculation his father had presented on the night Elena was given away. Through contacts maintained within the territory's broader network of pack alliances, Killian had learned of an old law, obscure and rarely invoked, that governed inheritance disputes within bonded pairs when one partner died before a bond was fully sealed. Under that law, if Elena had died alongside Draven, whether from the curse itself or from some other cause entirely, any lingering claim she might have developed to influence or property within the Nightshade Court would have passed automatically back to her original pack of origin, specifically, to Killian himself, as the mate whose bond with her, however incomplete, remained the first legally recognized connection on record. Killian had not offered Elena to Draven purely out of political convenience, as his father's public explanation had suggested that terrible night. He had done so with the calculated hope that she would die, alongside a dying king, whether from whatever illness was slowly claiming Draven's life, or, should that prove too slow, from more direct intervention, arranged quietly from a safe distance. Her death would have eliminated any possibility of Elena eventually asserting some rival claim through her bond to Draven, while simultaneously allowing Killian to inherit whatever fragments of political advantage her sacrifice might generate for the Ashford Pact's broader ambitions. He wanted me dead from the very beginning, Elena said quietly, the full weight of the betrayal settling over her, with a force that left her momentarily breathless. Not just discarded, dead. All so he could benefit twice over from a single sacrifice. Draven's expression carried a fury Elena had rarely seen from him, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger on her behalf. He miscalculated badly, he said. He assumed a rotting king would either kill you through neglect or allow you to be quietly disposed of without consequence. He did not anticipate that you would become someone I valued enough to protect fiercely, nor did he anticipate the bond that has grown between us, despite his scheming. Elena sat with the revelation for a long while, turning it over in her mind, searching for some trace of the grief she had once felt for the loss of what she believed she and Killian once shared. She found, to her own surprise, that very little of that old grief remained. In its place sat something harder and more clarifying. A cold, steady anger that felt almost like relief. The relief of finally understanding fully and completely that nothing about her relationship with Killian had ever been what she believed it to be. That every warm memory she had carried from their childhood together had apparently meant nothing next to his willingness to calculate her death as a political convenience. "What happens now?" she asked finally, looking up to meet Draven's steady gaze. "Does this change anything, practically, for the territory or for us?" "It changes a great deal," Draven said grimly. "Attempted assassination of a bonded mate to the crown is a serious violation of pack law, regardless of the political maneuvering behind it. I intend to bring formal charges against the Ashford pack, and against Killian specifically, once we have gathered sufficient evidence to ensure the charges hold under scrutiny from the broader Territorial Council." His expression softened slightly as he studied her face, searching for signs of how deeply the revelation had wounded her. "But that is a matter for strategy and patience, and I do not wish to rush toward action, driven purely by anger, however justified that anger might be. What matters most to me right now is how you are managing this news, Elena, not what response it eventually demands from the throne." Elena reached for his hand, drawing strength from the steady warmth of the bond that had settled between them in recent weeks. "I'm managing it," she said, and found, testing the words aloud, that they were largely true. "I think some part of me already suspected there was more to that night than his father's explanation offered. Learning the full truth hurts less than I expected, honestly. Mostly, it just makes me grateful I ended up here instead, however strange and unlikely a path it took to arrive at that outcome." Over the following weeks, as formal proceedings against the Ashford pack slowly gathered momentum through the Territorial Council's careful bureaucratic processes, Elena found herself increasingly drawn not backward, toward the anger and grief of her old life, but forward, toward the future she and Draven were quietly beginning to build together, despite the curse still hanging unresolved over both their heads. Their research into the broken pact continued alongside these new political complications, and slowly, painstakingly, they began to piece together not just the history of the betrayal, but hints toward what surviving members of the wronged bloodline might still exist, somewhere within the territory's scattered, displaced communities. It was during this same period that news arrived, unexpected and quietly devastating in its own way, that Killian himself had petitioned for an audience with the Territorial Council, seeking to defend himself against the charges Draven had formally filed. Elena was invited, as the wronged party, to attend the proceedings should she choose to, though Draven made clear she was under no obligation to face her former mate directly if she preferred to let the formal evidence speak for itself. Elena chose to attend. She told herself it was simply a matter of ensuring justice was properly served, of standing as a witness to whatever excuses or denials Killian intended to offer the council in his own defense. But standing in the formal chamber weeks later, watching Killian escorted in under guard, his expression carrying none of the careful confidence she remembered from their shared childhood, Elena understood that some part of her had needed this moment, for reasons that went beyond simple justice. She needed to see him clearly, one final time, stripped of whatever illusions she had once carried about who he truly was, so that she could finally, fully release whatever remaining hold his memory still carried over her. Killian did not deny the accusations, not fully, though he attempted to frame his actions as political necessity, rather than personal malice, insisting he had believed, genuinely, that sacrificing Elena served the greater good of pack stability across the territory. The council, unmoved by arguments that had already been thoroughly undermined by the evidence Draven's investigators had assembled, found him guilty of conspiracy against the crown, and ordered severe sanctions against both Killian personally and the broader Ashford pack. Sanctions that would strip them of significant territorial standing and influence for a generation to come. As guards led Killian from the chamber following the ruling, he paused briefly, his eyes finding Elena's across the room for the first time since the proceedings had begun. Whatever he intended to say, whatever apology or justification he might have offered in that final moment, Elena did not wait to hear it. She turned away deliberately, choosing instead to meet Draven's steady, supportive gaze from where he sat beside her, and found in that simple exchange everything she needed to finally, completely close the door on the life she had once imagined building with Killian Ashford. That evening, Walking together through the castle courtyard, as the last light of day faded gently toward evening, Elena felt lighter than she had in months, the old weight of betrayal finally lifting fully from her shoulders. "I think I'm ready," she said quietly, "to stop looking backward and start focusing entirely on whatever future we're building here." Draven squeezed her hand gently, his expression warm, despite the exhaustion that still lingered beneath his eyes, the curse's marks still dark along his skin, despite everything they had learned and accomplished together. "So am I," he said. "Whatever remains ahead of us, the curse, the search for the pack's surviving descendants, I would rather face all of it standing beside you than face any part of it alone." They walked together in comfortable silence after that, the courtyard around them quiet and still, and Elena found herself thinking, not for the first time, that the terrible night which had once seemed like the ending of her entire world had, against every possible expectation, become instead the beginning of something far more meaningful than anything she had imagined for herself, before chains and betrayal rewrote the course of her life so completely. The final piece of the puzzle arrived from an unexpected source, a letter delivered to the castle, several weeks after Killian's formal sentencing, sent by an elderly woman living in a remote village near the territory's northern border. The letter, written in careful, old-fashioned script, explained that the woman had heard rumors traveling through trade routes about the king's search for descendants of a pack destroyed generations earlier, and she believed her own family's oral history might hold relevant information. Elena and Draven traveled north together within the week, accompanied by a small guard escort, both of them eager, despite the uncertainty of what they might find. The journey took 3 days, following roads that grew increasingly narrow and unfamiliar the further they traveled from the Nightshade stronghold, winding eventually into hill country neither of them had visited before. The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Wren, welcomed them into her modest home with evident nervousness, clearly unaccustomed to hosting royalty within her humble walls. She explained, once they were settled with tea warming in front of a small fire, that her family had passed down stories for generations about an ancestor who survived the destruction of a pack in the territory's north, a pack betrayed by a more powerful ally who abandoned them to a devastating attack rather than honoring an old alliance. "My grandmother always said we carried old blood," Wren explained, her weathered hands wrapped carefully around her own teacup. "Blood tied to some old promise broken long before her own birth. She spoke of it rarely, and always with a kind of sadness I never fully understood as a child." Draven leaned forward, his expression intent despite the fatigue the journey had clearly cost him. "Do you know the specific terms of the old promise?" he asked. "Anything about magic or blood binding that might have been part of the original agreement?" Wren considered the question carefully, before nodding slowly. "My grandmother spoke of a binding, sealed through blood and given word, meant to last generations, broken by betrayal, before it could be properly honored. She said the binding demanded acknowledgement, eventually, from whoever carried the blood of the one who broke it. Acknowledgement freely given, not forced or purchased, before the debt could finally be considered paid." Draven absorbed this information carefully, and Elena watched understanding slowly dawn across his tired features. "Acknowledgement," he repeated quietly. "Not vengeance, not restitution through wealth or territory, but simple, honest acknowledgement of the wrong that was done. That would explain why nothing my healers ever attempted made any difference," he said, turning to Elena, with something like cautious hope brightening his exhausted eyes. "The curse was never seeking punishment through suffering alone. It was waiting for someone from my bloodline to finally, honestly acknowledge what my grandfather did, freely, and without political calculation behind the gesture." They spent that evening and much of the following day with Wren, carefully documenting everything her family's oral history could offer, and by the time Elena and Draven began their journey back toward the stronghold, they carried with them not just information, but a plan. Fragile and uncertain, but a plan nonetheless. The ceremony, when they finally arranged it weeks later, took place at the ruins of the original binding site, a clearing deep within the northern hills where, according to old records finally located with Wren's guidance, the original pact had been sealed generations earlier between the two pack leaders. Little remained of whatever structure had once marked the location, only weathered stones arranged in a rough circle, half sunken now into earth and moss, But Elena felt something ancient and watchful in the clearing's quiet stillness the moment they arrived. Draven knelt at the center of the stone circle, as dusk settled over the clearing, Elena standing close beside him, Ren present as well, having traveled with them to help guide whatever ritual acknowledgement the old binding required. Draven spoke slowly and carefully, his voice carrying clearly through the still evening air, naming his grandfather's betrayal explicitly, acknowledging the destruction it had caused, the lives lost, the generations of suffering that had followed from a promise broken purely for the sake of political convenience. "I cannot undo what was done," he said, his voice carrying a raw sincerity Elena had never heard from him before, not even during their most private, vulnerable conversations. "I cannot bring back what was destroyed, or return what was stolen from a pack that no longer exists to receive restitution. But I offer this acknowledgement freely, without calculation, without seeking anything in return beyond simple honesty about a wrong my bloodline committed and has never properly answered for until this moment." As his words settled into the quiet clearing, something extraordinary began happening. The dark marks along his exposed skin, marks that had spread steadily for 3 long years, despite every treatment his healers had attempted, began, slowly and unmistakably, to fade. Elena watched, breathless, as the blackened veins along his hands and neck lightened gradually toward something closer to his natural skin tone, the process gentle but undeniable, confirmation finally arriving that Ren's family history had led them toward the true answer at last. Draven gasped, pressing a hand against his own chest, as though testing whether the sensation he felt matched what his eyes were witnessing across his skin. "I can feel it," he said, wonder breaking clearly through his voice. Something lifting, some weight I had grown so accustomed to carrying that I nearly forgot what its absence might feel like. Elena knelt beside him, tears gathering unexpectedly in her own eyes as she watched the transformation continue, relief and joy tangling together into something almost overwhelming. "It's working," she said. "Draven, it's actually working." By the time full darkness settled over the clearing, the marks along Draven's skin had faded almost entirely, leaving only the faintest traces behind, more shadow than substance, and his breathing, Elena noticed with quiet amazement, had steadied into something stronger and more even than she had heard from him since her arrival at the castle so many months earlier. Ren watched the transformation with tears of her own gathering in her weathered eyes. "My grandmother would have wept to see this," she said softly. Generations of quiet grief, finally answered. They returned to the stronghold 3 days later, Draven's strength visibly improving with each passing hour, color returning to his face in a way that made the castle's staff pause in visible astonishment whenever he passed through the halls. The healers who examined him upon their return could offer no medical explanation for the sudden, dramatic improvement, though none of them pressed too hard for answers, apparently content simply to witness a recovery none of them had believed possible only weeks earlier. That evening, standing together on a balcony overlooking the courtyard, as stars began emerging across the clearing night sky, Draven turned to Elena with an expression she had not seen from him before, something unburdened and hopeful in a way 3 years of illness had never allowed him to fully express. "I owe you everything," he said quietly, "not simply my life, though that alone would be considerable enough. I owe you the chance to imagine a future again, something I had stopped allowing myself to hope for long before you ever arrived at this castle." "You don't owe me anything," Elena said, reaching for his hand, feeling the warmth of the true mate bond settled comfortably now between them, steady and certain in a way that no longer surprised her. "I chose to stay. I chose to search for answers. Whatever future we build together now, we're building it as equal partners, not as debtor and creditor." Draven smiled, the expression sitting easily on his face now in a way that had grown increasingly natural over recent months, and pulled her gently closer. "Equal partners then," he agreed, "building whatever comes next, together, exactly as we've faced everything else since the night you arrived here in chains." Behind them, unseen in the shadows of a nearby corridor, Lord Servin watched the joyful scene unfold, with narrowed, calculating eyes, understanding with growing alarm that whatever plans he had quietly been constructing for the eventual transition of power now faced an entirely unexpected complication. A king, restored to full health and strength, standing firmly beside a woman whose influence over the throne had clearly grown far beyond anything Servin could still hope to easily unravel. Servin moved against them 3 weeks later, choosing a night when Draven had traveled to a neighboring territory to formally renew alliances that his restored health had finally made possible again, leaving Elena at the stronghold with only a modest guard contingent for protection. It was, Elena would later understand, exactly the kind of calculated timing that had allowed Servin to survive and thrive within court politics for as long as he had, always waiting patiently for the precise moment when his targets stood most vulnerable. She woke well past midnight to the sound of raised voices echoing through the castle corridors, followed quickly by the unmistakable clash of weapons somewhere below her chambers. Rosalind burst into her room moments later, her face pale with fear, explaining in a rushed, frightened voice that Lord Servin had moved against the castle guard loyal to Draven, claiming the king's continued recovery represented dangerous, unnatural magic that threatened the stability of the entire territory, magic that required immediate intervention to prevent further corruption of the throne. "He's declaring himself regent," Rosalind explained, helping Elena dress quickly despite her trembling hands. "Says the king isn't fit to rule until further investigation clears him of whatever unnatural influence restored his health so suddenly. He's already had half the guard arrested, the ones still loyal to his majesty. The rest have either joined him or fled." Elena's mind raced through the implications, even as she moved quickly to gather what few weapons she could find within her quarters. Servin had clearly been planning this moment for some time, waiting only for an opportunity, when Draven's absence would leave the throne vulnerable to exactly this kind of sudden, forceful seizure. Whatever loyalty he had once pledged to the crown had apparently always been secondary to his own ambitions, patient and calculating enough to wait years for precisely the right moment to strike. "We need to get word to Draven," Elena said, her mind already working through possible strategies, despite the fear tightening in her chest. "And we need to find whoever remains loyal within the castle before Servin consolidates control completely." Rosalind nodded, though her expression remained tight with fear. "Marta might know who can still be trusted. She's served this household longer than almost anyone, longer even than Lord Servin himself." They found Marta in the castle kitchens, along with several other senior staff members who had gathered there in quiet, frightened clusters, uncertain what the sudden upheaval meant for their own safety within the household. Marta's face, when Elena explained the situation and asked for help identifying which guards and staff might remain loyal to Draven, hardened with a determination that reminded Elena, briefly, of her own resolve during those difficult early weeks, navigating an unfamiliar and hostile court. "There are more of us loyal to the true king than Lord Servin realizes," Marta said firmly. "He's grown arrogant these past years, assuming fear alone secures obedience. He's forgotten that many of us remember what this castle looked like under proper leadership, before illness weakened His Majesty's grip on daily affairs and allowed Servin's influence to grow unchecked." Over the following tense hours, working carefully through the castle's less traveled corridors and servant passages, Elena and Marta managed to gather a small but determined group of guards and staff members, still willing to resist Servin's sudden power grab, while Rosalind slipped away to send urgent word toward the neighboring territory, where Draven remained, hopefully still unaware of the crisis unfolding in his absence. Servin, meanwhile, had moved quickly to secure the castle's main hall and throne room, positioning his own loyalists throughout the most strategically important sections of the fortress, while declaring, through hastily gathered proclamations read aloud to the confused remaining household, that the king's recovery represented dangerous evidence of forbidden magic requiring immediate investigation by the Territorial Council, investigation that conveniently required Servin's own temporary assumption of full regent authority in the meantime. Elena understood, listening to reports filtering back through her small network of loyal allies, that Servin's plan depended heavily on speed and confusion, seizing enough control before Draven could return to properly contest the sudden claims being made against him. If they could simply hold out, delay Servin's consolidation of power long enough for Draven to make his way back to the stronghold, the entire coup attempt would likely collapse the moment the king himself stood before the gathered court, to personally refute whatever accusations Servin had constructed against him. The confrontation that finally settled the matter came just before dawn, when Servin, growing increasingly frustrated by the resistance his forces encountered throughout the castle's more remote sections, personally led a group of loyalist guards toward the eastern wing, apparently having received word that Elena herself was coordinating much of the quiet rebellion against his authority. Elena met him in the same narrow corridor where Draven's chamber lay just beyond, refusing to retreat further despite the guards flanking Servin on either side, their weapons drawn and ready. "You've caused considerably more trouble than I anticipated," Servin said, his usual pleasant composure finally cracking under the strain of a plan unraveling faster than he had expected. "I should have removed you from this castle the moment you began proving useful to His Majesty, rather than simply decorative." "You mean the moment I started uncovering the truth about the curse you clearly hoped would eventually kill him and leave you free to seize power through more conventional means," Elena said, standing her ground, despite the fear coursing through her at the sight of armed guards advancing steadily closer. Something flickered across Servin's face, confirmation enough of his true motivations that Elena did not need him to explicitly admit the accusation aloud. "The throne requires stability," he said instead, his voice tightening with barely controlled anger. "A dying king provides no stability. A king restored through means no one can properly explain provides even less. Someone within this court needed to prepare for whatever transition became necessary, regardless of how uncomfortable that preparation proved for those unwilling to face difficult realities." "You mean you needed a dying king to stay conveniently dying, so you could position yourself to control whatever came next," Elena countered. "And when he recovered instead, threatening everything you had carefully built toward, you decided seizing power directly was preferable to watching your plans collapse entirely." Before Servin could respond, a commotion erupted from the corridor behind his gathered guards, and Elena felt her heart leap with sudden hope as she recognized the sound of Draven's voice, carrying clearly through the chaos, followed quickly by the unmistakable presence of the king himself, moving with the full strength and authority that his restored health had finally returned to him, flanked by loyal guards who had apparently intercepted word of the crisis and rushed to meet him at the castle gates upon his early return. "Lord Servin," Draven said, his voice carrying easily through the sudden silence that fell over the corridor, cold and unmistakably furious. "I believe you have some explaining to do regarding the unusual proclamations circulating through my castle in my absence." Servin's composure cracked further at the sight of the king standing very much alive and very much in full command of the situation, whatever plans he had constructed around Draven's continued absence, clearly collapsing in real time before his eyes. "Your Majesty," he began, attempting to recover some measure of his usual smooth diplomatic tone. "I acted only out of concern for the throne's stability, given the unexplained and potentially dangerous nature of your sudden recovery." "You acted," Draven said, cutting cleanly through the attempted justification, "because you saw an opportunity to seize power, while you believed I remained too far away to stop you. Do not insult either of us by pretending otherwise." The guards who had followed Servin into the corridor, sensing clearly which direction the confrontation was now turning, began lowering their weapons one by one, unwilling to continue backing a coup attempt that had so visibly and completely failed the moment the king himself arrived to personally contest it. Servin, recognizing the shift in loyalty happening around him, made one final, desperate attempt at deflection. "The people deserve to know the truth about how your recovery was achieved," he said, his voice rising with barely controlled panic. "Magic powerful enough to reverse 3 years of confirmed illness within a single evening. Ask yourself, Your Majesty, whether such power arrived without cost, without consequence, that this court has not yet fully reckoned with." "The cost," Draven said, his voice hard and certain, "was honesty. Something you have clearly forgotten the value of during your years accumulating influence through manipulation and quiet schemes. My recovery came through acknowledging a debt my own bloodline owed. Honestly and without calculation, exactly the opposite of everything you have demonstrated throughout this entire miserable attempt at seizing my throne." Servin's shoulders finally sagged, defeat settling visibly over his features, as the last of his loyalist guards fully withdrew their support, leaving him standing alone and exposed before a king he had gravely underestimated. "What happens to me now?" he asked quietly, all pretense of confidence finally abandoned. "You will face formal judgment before the Territorial Council," Draven said, "for conspiracy against the crown and attempted seizure of power through fraudulent claims. Whatever mercy the Council chooses to extend will depend entirely on their own judgment, not mine. I find myself tonight disinclined to advocate strongly on your behalf. Guards moved forward to take Servin into custody, and Elena watched him led away with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease, understanding that whatever threat Servin himself had represented, the deeper currents of ambition and resentment running through this court likely extended beyond just one man's schemes, however central he had proven to this particular crisis. As dawnlight finally began spilling through the eastern windows, Draven turned to Elena, his expression softening from the cold authority he had commanded moments earlier into something warmer and infinitely more relieved. "Are you all right?" he asked, pulling her carefully into his arms. "Rosalind's message reached me faster than I dared hope, but I feared I would not return in time regardless." "I'm all right," Elena said, allowing herself finally to relax against him, now that the immediate danger had fully passed. "Marta and the others helped hold things together until you arrived. This castle has more loyalty left in it than Servin ever gave it credit for." Draven pressed a grateful kiss to the top of her head, his relief evident in the way his arms tightened around her. "Then we owe a great deal to everyone who stood firm tonight," he said. "And we have considerable work ahead of us, rebuilding trust within this court, and ensuring nothing like tonight's crisis threatens this throne again." Elena nodded against his chest, exhausted but steady, already beginning to think through the challenges that still lay ahead, even as the immediate crisis finally, fully resolved around them. Whatever came next, she understood clearly now, she would face it, not as a frightened tribute dragged unwillingly into an unfamiliar court, but as someone who had earned her place here through courage, loyalty, and hard-won trust, standing firmly beside the king she had come, against every possible expectation, to genuinely and deeply love. The Territorial Council delivered its judgment against Lord Servin 3 weeks later, stripping him of all titles and influence within the Nightshade Court and exiling him permanently from the territory, a sentence Draven accepted without objection, though several members of the council had argued privately for harsher punishment, given the severity of his attempted coup. Draven, restored fully now to both health and the clear-headed judgment that illness had gradually eroded over 3 long years, insisted that exile served the territory's stability better than further bloodshed, a decision Elena found herself quietly admiring for the mercy it demonstrated, even toward a man who had shown her so little of it in return. With the immediate crisis resolved, the castle slowly began settling into a new rhythm, one markedly different from the quiet, grief-heavy atmosphere that had characterized it during Elena's first difficult months within its walls. Servants moved through the corridors with visibly lighter steps now, no longer weighed down by the constant, exhausting anticipation of their king's eventual death. The eastern wing, once left hollow and forgotten, had slowly begun filling again with warmth and activity, Elena having quietly requested several rooms be restored and reopened, a small but meaningful gesture toward reclaiming a part of the castle that had been abandoned for far too long. It was on a bright morning several months after Servin's exile that Draven called Elena to his chamber, his expression carrying a nervous energy she had rarely seen from him, even during the most tense moments of their shared struggles against the curse and the subsequent coup attempt. "I have spoken with the Territorial Council," he said, once she had settled into the chair across from him, "and with the senior members of this court, regarding a matter I have been considering carefully for some time now." "That sounds ominous," Elena said, though a small smile tugged at her lips, sensing something different in his careful, deliberate tone than the grave concern that usually accompanied such formal announcements. Draven rose from his seat and crossed the room to kneel before her, taking her hands gently in his own, and Elena felt her breath catch as understanding began dawning across her features. "Elena Voss," he said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability clearly visible in his expression. "You arrived at this castle in chains, given away by people who never understood your true worth. You stayed, though nothing obligated you to, and you helped save my life through courage and determination I still find myself amazed by, even months later. You stood firm against a coup that would have destroyed everything I have worked to rebuild, and you have shown this entire court what genuine loyalty looks like, freely given, rather than demanded through fear or obligation." He paused, drawing a steadying breath before continuing. "I am asking you now, freely, without any of the political calculation or forced circumstance that first brought us together, whether you would choose to remain here, not simply as my mate, bonded through fate's own choosing, but as my queen, standing beside me, openly and permanently, ruling this territory together, as true and equal partners. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, joy and disbelief tangling together as she looked down at the man she had once feared, then respected, then finally, deeply loved, kneeling before her now with an earnestness that erased every trace of the political tribute she had once been forced to become. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Draven, I choose this. I choose you, freely and completely, exactly as you're asking me to." The coronation ceremony took place several weeks later, in the same great hall where Servin had once tried to have her condemned for treason, based on forged evidence, now transformed with careful decoration, and gathered crowds representing every corner of the territory, packs both large and small arriving to witness the formal crowning of a queen, whose story had, by that point, traveled far beyond the Nightshade stronghold's own walls. Elena stood at the center of the hall as the ceremonial crown was carefully placed upon her head, Draven standing proudly beside her, his health fully restored, his expression carrying none of the exhaustion or resignation that had once weighed so heavily upon him during their first meeting so many months earlier. The gathered court, the same court that had once watched her arrive as chained tribute with careful, guarded suspicion, now offered genuine applause and warmth, having witnessed firsthand the courage and integrity she had demonstrated throughout every crisis this territory had faced during her time within these walls. Among the crowd, unexpected and carefully positioned near the back of the hall, Elena's gaze found Killian, present as part of the formal delegation the disgraced Ashford pack had been required to send, following his sentencing months earlier, a small but symbolically important gesture of continued deference to the crown, despite their diminished standing. He watched the ceremony with an expression Elena could not fully read from such distance, something caught between shame and reluctant recognition of everything he had thrown away that fateful night, when he chose ambition and calculated betrayal over the woman fate had bonded him to. Elena held his gaze for only a moment before turning her attention fully back to Draven, understanding, with quiet, settled certainty, that whatever regret Killian carried now meant very little to the life she had built for herself since that terrible night. A life built not on the fragile, incomplete bond he had so carelessly discarded, but on genuine partnership, hard-won trust, and love, freely chosen, rather than fated into existence without either party's true understanding or consent. That evening, standing together on the same balcony where Draven had first spoken of, owing her everything following the curse's breaking, Elena looked out over the courtyard below, now restored and thriving under months of careful attention, flowers blooming where wild, untended grass had once grown between broken cobblestones, and felt a deep, settled contentment she had never expected to find again after chains first closed around her wrists so many months earlier. "Do you ever think about that night?" Draven asked quietly, his arms settled comfortably around her shoulders. "The night everything changed, when you arrived here as tribute rather than choice?" "Sometimes," Elena admitted, "but less as tragedy now, and more as the strange, painful beginning of everything that eventually led me here. To you, to this life I never could have imagined choosing for myself before that night forced my hand entirely." She turned to look up at him, her expression soft with genuine, hard-earned happiness. "I used to think that night was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Now I understand it was simply the door that opened onto everything that actually mattered." Draven smiled, pulling her closer, and together they watched the sun set fully behind the hills surrounding their territory, casting warm, golden light across a castle that had once felt like a tomb, slowly closing around a dying king, now transformed into something entirely different, a home built on courage, honesty, and a bond neither of them had asked for but both had come, through every trial and danger they had faced together, to treasure completely. The rotting king had been offered a discarded bride, a political tribute, meant to secure loyalty from a desperate pack, with no understanding of her true worth. What that pack could never have anticipated, what even Elena herself could not have imagined on that terrible night when chains first closed around her wrists, was that the woman they discarded so carelessly would become not just a queen, but the very reason their dying king found the strength to live again, and the reason an entire territory found, against every possible expectation, a future far brighter than anyone had dared to hope for during those long, difficult years of quiet, patient decay.